Hello again, and welcome to Oilfield Strong webinar series. This is Grant Swartzwelder. I'm president of OTA Environmental Solutions and happy to host this series of hopefully informative webinars. As you know, you can access this through YouTube and just look at Oilfield Strong. We're also rolling out all these series, the audio part of it, on podcasts. So any of your podcast channels, you should be able to find us and listen in. So please take advantage. Please share it with your friends. I think we've got some very interesting topics. This one is especially interesting because I think it talks about something that not a lot of people really understand, and that's plugging and abandonment of wells. And to speak to that, I have Austin McDaniel, who I've known for quite a while. He is president of the McDaniel Companies, which is a huge plugger of wells and has vast experience in this. So Austin, welcome, and glad you're going to be able to share with us. So if you would kind of explain what the McDaniel Company does, and then we'll move into the specifics of plugging.
Yeah, thanks, Grant. It's great to be here. Appreciate you inviting me on today to talk about a topic that is certainly near and dear to my heart, and one that I kind of eat, sleep, and breathe pretty much day in, day out, which is, as you described, plugging and abandonment. We are a P&A company, a family-owned and operated P&A company. We actually got into the plugging business kind of by accident in slower times during the industry back in the mid-'80s. The company was founded in the '60s by my grandfather. And for the first 25 years of the company's existence, all we did was sell new and used tubing and casing. We were an OCTG supplier, but that business, the pipe business, was a tough business to be in the mid-'80s when prices crashed and the rig count crashed.
Yep.
So they discovered that rather than buying a bunch of new inventory from mills, it was actually cheaper to go out and plug wells and pull pipe out of the ground. So the plugging really was just a conduit to source pipe for us for our pipe sales. But that's how we got into the business. And still active today in the used pipe side of the business from the reclamation or from the salvage work that we do from the P&As. But we basically manage large scale P&A programs for companies of all sizes, from large majors, independents, all the way to kind of smaller mom and pop type companies who often have less wells to plug, but we still do some work for them as well. But pretty much handle the entire scope of the process, from kind of the regulatory permitting and submittals to day-to-day operations management of the P&A rigs and doing the downhole work, to the production equipment removal at the site once the well has actually been plugged downhole, and then the final surface reclamation and restoration after all the equipment's removed. So kind of got our hands in a few of the different elements of the P&A and reclamation process, and glad to be here today to talk to you about it and hopefully inform your viewers and audience a little bit more about the world of P&A.
When I've dug into this, it definitely seems more complicated. People think you just go plug a well, but there's a lot of steps that go into this, and you alluded to them in general terms right there. But why don't you, if you would, let's talk about the steps involved and what you have to do along the way. And again, you mentioned it, but let's go into a little more detail. So someone calls up, says, I've got a well that is ready to be plugged. What do you do?
Yeah, so wells need to be plugged for a variety of reasons. Inactivity is the most common. Wells that are obviously no longer producing, that have been shut in, that have potentially failed a mechanical integrity test, those require abandonment. It's a regulated driven operation. Here in Texas, it's the Railroad Commission. Other states have their own regulatory bodies that oversee oil and gas activities that mandate that operators plug their wells to be in compliance, or if not, they face fines and penalties and other issues. So there are other reasons why people would plug wells. Landowner concerns, development in a certain area where a well may not necessarily be inactive, but it's maybe more valuable, the land, than it is as a marginal producing well. People plug wells because of kind of parent-child frac interference, so that you don't have a well that's, maybe a vertical well that's got a well that you're going to frac nearby, and you're potentially worried about taking a frac hit. So there's a number of reasons. Generally, inactivity is the most common. But the first step of the process, once the well has sort of been identified that needs to be plugged, you've got to get the ball rolling kind of two ways. One, you've obviously got to get an AFE out to your partners. So you've got to get a bid and a cost in from a provider like myself, so you can kind of have an estimate of what the job is going to cost. So you'll send out your AFE to your working interest partners, and generally that's a 30 or 60-day process, kind of depending on the terms of the lease. So you get that out. And then you'll also get the ball rolling with respect to the regulatory permitting. There's certain forms and filings that have to be submitted in order to get the well properly approved by the regulatory agencies. We'll submit a procedure that we're going to follow during the job. The agencies will review that procedure and sometimes edit, comment, or make additions to the procedure if they want additional plugs drawn in or additional stacks of cement. So that all gets submitted, and then usually in a couple weeks you'll get that back. And once you've got the approved permit, you can pretty much look to mobilize the equipment, assuming all of your partners are signed off on the job, the AFE is approved, and everything else internally within the company has been taken care of.
So then, and cost associated with this is roughly what?
Well, as you can imagine, the cost of the actual plugging.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, as you can imagine, plugging costs, vary tremendously. And really the biggest driver of cost differentiation is well depth. The deeper the well, the more expensive to plug. The deeper the well, the more plugs. And
if it's horizontal, do you have to plug that horizontal?
You do not.
So,
No,
it's a vertical aspect that you're worried about.
That's correct. If you think about a reservoir, everything in a horizontal reservoir is already communicating anyway, whether or not there's a wellbore there. There's already natural fractures and porosity. So anything that's in that reservoir is already in communication. You just don't want anything from the reservoirs to communicate up the hole. So really, it's the vertical protection that you're worried about. And so for horizontal wells, the first plug you set is at the top of the kickoff point, and you essentially plug it just like you would any other vertical producer. Okay. So yeah, depth is really the biggest determining factor of your ultimate cost to plug a well. A 10,000-foot well is going to be a lot more costly than a 2,000-foot well, just based on the consumables between the cement, the perforating runs, the water, the fluids, and then of course the time over the well.
And I know it's hard to, but give our listeners at least a range. Is a 2,000-foot well, is that 5,000 or 50,000? Or you can give a range. I'm not trying to tie it down, but just to make people understand kind of roughly what we're talking.
A good ballpark number to use for P&A cost is about $7 or $8 per foot. So if you're looking at a 10,000-foot well, you're looking at approximately $70,000 to $80,000 to plug it. If you're looking at a 2,000-foot well, you're looking at $14,000 to $16,000 to plug it. So,
and that's because of the extra cement and the extra time.
Extra time just to trip in and out of the hole with the pipe, the extra cement, the amount of plugs that you've got to set. Depth is always going to be the biggest cost determining factor in a job.
Okay. Well, I apologize. I took us a hard left on that. Let's go back to what we were talking about till I messed us up. So after you get the regulatory and you move on to location, you move on with a workover unit to pull the pipe or pull the casing. Walk us through what happens on the location.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So the equipment package consists of course, a rig, but in addition to the rig, you've got ancillary support equipment that serves the purpose of the plugging. You've got pump trucks, you've got bulk trucks. Of course, you've got a BOP on the well. You've got a wireline unit. You've got a doghouse for the crew, backhoe, various tools that you need for, handling pipe and casing potentially. So, when we show up, it's a rig plus, 5 or 6 different pieces of equipment that kind of go to the plugging.
And are you the contractor for all of that, or is it typical for a P&A company to have all that and bring it on?
That's right. Yeah, we do like a turnkey package, so where we're supplying all of the materials, equipment, and personnel needed to carry out the job. There are some things that we don't supply that we ask an operator to furnish for us that are kind of smaller ancillary items like a porta-john, a trash trailer, things like that we just don't really want to own, I guess, and maintain. So those items are generally supplied by third parties.
Okay. All right. So you rig up. And now downhole, you go down. What's the process of that? What are you pulling first? And then how's that work to the point that you actually have it cemented up?
Yeah, so the first step is essentially pulling out all of your tubing and rod downhole configuration, packers, anchors, pumps, anything that was put in the well, for the pumping aspect. And generally, the first couple days, if you're going to run into problems, it's generally during these days because a lot of these wells that we're rigging up on haven't been pulled in or touched in a number of years. Often they've been sitting idle for years, if not decades. They may have come to an operator via an acquisition and never produced since that operator's owned it. The well records may be a bit spotty and lacking. So sometimes those first couple of days are really just kind of fact finding. A lot of times because these wells have been sitting idle, you have the potential for mechanical problems downhole, like parted tubing, collapsed casing, packers or anchors that you can't get free.
And what's the significance of that if you have those type of issues?
Costs, cost is the significance of that
Because
because
it's harder to get that stuff out.
it is.
You're having to go in with extra equipment or extra things to break it apart or mill through it or whatever.
That's right. So sometimes one of the biggest cost drivers on a P&A job can be just getting the well prepped and in a condition to where you can start setting your plugs, which all of that is counted in. Just getting the tubing and rods and the downhole assembly out of the well can be sometimes the most taxing part of the job.
Okay. All right. So you go through, you get all that stuff out. What do you do with that equipment?
Well, once it's all pulled, you lay it all down and you either use the production tubing from the well if you can, if it's good enough to be used, if the structural integrity is of good enough quality, or if not, if it's bad pipe, you can lay your production tubing down and pick up a work string. And really your first step is to run in and set a bridge plug. The bridge plug is the first plug that goes in the well. It's a mechanical or wireline operated tool, steel plug that you would set at the very bottom of the well bore, above your perforations or above your kickoff point where your lateral is. So that's the first step. You set your bridge plug, and then you dump bale cement on top of it to ensure that you've got a good cement cap on top of your plug. And then the next step is to circulate the well bore with mud. Mud is required to be placed in the well in between your cement plugs. So the first step's the bridge plug plus some cement as a cap, and then you're circulating the well with mud. Once that,
And how much cement are you putting on top there? Is that a regulated amount? That's part of what you sent to the Railroad Commission and said you put X amount in?
That's right. And if you're dump baling on wireline, generally you're pumping 2 sacks, which gets you anywhere from 10 to 50 feet of fill on top of it. If you're tubing pumping, generally you're pumping a minimum of 10 sacks on top of your bridge plug. So it's just a small cement cap on top of the bridge plug. And then you're circulating your well with mud. And then once that's done, now you're ready to follow the approved procedure that you've gotten from the regulatory agency that itemizes the depths and volumes where the plugs are to be pumped throughout the well.
Okay. Now, at one point, I thought folks would go and cut the casing and bring certain casing in. Is that still happening, or is that casing left in there?
No, it's definitely still happening. In fact, that's a big part of our business, and the recovery of casing is something that we are, always looking to pull when the conditions present themselves. There are variables where you would pull casing where it makes sense to pull casing, and others where it does not. Age of well is a big one. If a well was drilled in the 50s or 60s, that pipe's been in the ground a long time, and really the condition of that pipe is not really suitable to be pulled. One of the areas where we do a lot of work right now is in the Barnett Shale. The Barnett was kind of the first generation of shale plays. A lot of those wells are kind of entering their maturity and later life and becoming somewhat, marginally economic. So we're actually doing a lot of P&A work there. And the Barnett really wasn't drilled that many years ago. A lot of these wells that we're plugging are, 10, 12, 15 years old. So we find that's a great area for pipe recovery and an area we pull casing quite often. So
And the quality of the pipe is important because you're ultimately going to sell that to someone to use elsewhere. So
that's
it's got to
right.
be of a quality that works.
Absolutely, yes. So, the pipe that is good enough to be re-ran downhole is going to have the highest value for that pipe. If it's less, if the quality is not good enough to be re-ran downhole after we've subjected it to a variety of inspection criteria, then it's sold off as structural for a lower price point than what it would be if it was downhole quality material.
What do you mean sold off as structural? What's
So
structural?
yeah, so pipe the casing, for instance, 5.5 inch casing. If it comes out of the well and it's deteriorated, if it's got fractures or holes or pitting that is not suitable to be reran in a well, there are applications where you can repurpose that pipe for structural applications. That would be going to builders that would be building it really anything. We sell a lot of pipe off to farmers and ranchers that are building fences and use it for fence post material. So
Okay.
there, even pipe that's not good enough to be reran in a well always has a structural application and market, to be resold as.
Okay. No, that's helpful. So, all right. So you've put your bridge plug in. Now you're starting to add. So where are those additional zones that you're worried about, or how many additional uh, plugs, cement are you putting in?
Yeah, of course, it all depends on. Right, all depends on the depth, of course, but there's always throughout any well, you're always going to set plugs over certain intervals, and that's always going to be a casing shoe. So anytime you have a casing shoe, whether it's an intermediate or surface casing shoe, you're going to have a plug there. Generally, you're setting plugs over DV tools. Any area that may have a potential leak source or areas that you'd like to isolate. And then in addition to those areas, you're setting plugs over other producing intervals that may be up the hole from where you are presenting just to protect that formation. And then as you get closer to the surface, you're always going to protect the freshwater reservoirs and aquifers. So any freshwater table that's been identified in that wellbore throughout your regulatory permitting process, you're always going to set plugs across the freshwater zones. And really, the protection of the freshwater zones and the aquifers is really the main driver of why you plug wells, because you're just not wanting the things that are deeper in your well, that the horizon that you're producing from, to leak up the wellbore and potentially create contamination in the freshwater zones. You may have seen some stories in West Texas that's occurred, and I think East Texas as well. And over years of oil and gas operations in some of these areas, it's just sometimes just an unfortunate kind of side effect. Sometimes the well construction back in the early days wasn't as good to kind of prevent some of that migration and cross flows. But really, at the end of the day, that's the main driver of what you're attempting to accomplish.
So let me do another hard right on us.
Oh,
So
yeah.
when you talk about protecting the water source, is it mainly the internal part of the pipe that you're worried about? Because you also wonder, you've set casing and you have cement around it. Is there communication on the outside also? And is there anything you can do about that? Or is that even part of a P&A procedure?
Absolutely. Yeah, no, it definitely is. And you're really wanting 360-degree cement coverage across the wellbore, whether that's in the ID or in the annulus of the pipe. So if casing is not pulled and you have a void on the backside in your annulus, if the cement was not circulated to surface, or if you have kind of ratty cement and don't have good cement bonding across the outside and backside of the casing, then we employ a perf and squeeze technique where we're actually shooting perforating holes on wire line through the casing in order to get cement out on the backside, to ensure that cement's not only on the inside of the pipe, but also on the OD as well, the outside diameter.
Okay.
Right. So that we can ensure that, yes, because there are channeling annuluses, microannuluses that can then occur on the backside. So you want to make sure you've got cement really across every potential source of migration that you can, and shooting perf holes and squeezing on the backside is the way we accomplish that.
Okay, very good. All right, so you've you protected all these different intervals, so you're up to the surface. Now what?
Well, once you get to your surface, you're basically cutting and capping the well. So you're cutting off the wellhead below the ground level. You are welding a plate on below the ground level. And then depending on the state that you're in, some states require a above ground riser, a 4-inch piece of pipe that sticks a few feet above the ground that has the well information stenciled into the riser so that anybody could, drive up and see the well information on the side there. Other states, you don't weld risers, above ground risers on, you just cut and cap it at surface or below the ground, and then backfill it. So you would really never even know a well existed. But yes, you're basically setting a cement plug there at your surface, and you are identifying the well whether it's with an above ground dry hole riser with some stenciling that you stencil in with a cutting torch, either on an above ground riser or below ground marker, so that if
Now,
somebody
now, throughout this process, are you doing any type of pressure checks or QC type checks to make sure that things aren't communicating?
Absolutely, yeah. So during the actual downhole P&A process, you're often pressure testing your plugs, especially after a squeeze. If we were to perforate and squeeze a plug and left it shut in overnight, for instance, if we got out there the next morning and could pump into it, well, that means those perforations are still open and that cement is still going out into either the backside or into a void. So we would need to re-squeeze that plug. So pressure testing occurs often to make sure that the plugs are holding. We are also tagging with tubing, which is basically running in the hole, setting your tubing down after the cement has had a chance to cure and to harden to ensure that the plug is there. So you are verifying your plugs through pressure testing, through tagging, and then at surface, we're also doing bubble tests to make sure that there's no gas migration to the surface before the wellhead gets cut off. We're doing sniffer tests with gas monitors to make sure that there's no presence of LELs or any gas molecules before the wellhead gets cut off, because you don't want to cut off a wellhead and potentially still have a leak, somewhere below where now that the wellhead's cut off, you have a harder time getting back down to access potentially
Sure.
that area of concern. So yes, there's definitely some QC that goes on throughout the P&A process.
And is this something that the McDaniel companies have come up with, or is this also some of that is probably just QC that y'all do, but some of it I would assume is Railroad Commission or the state agency required?
Yeah, I would say it's pretty much just industry standard, those steps, whether it was, us as the contractor, any competent contractor is going to be following basically
Okay.
those same processes to ensure that the plugs that they're pumping are where they intend to be, that they're holding pressure tests, and that they're not seeing any, bubbling or any presence of gas at surface before cutting the wellhead off.
Okay. All right. So you've sealed up the well. Now you've got what is it, a 80 by 80 location, or I don't know how big. It depends. Probably West Texas, pretty good size. Does the plugging company also do the land reclamation, or is that a separate thing?
Well, it is and it isn't. It's a separate crew and a separate equipment profile, obviously, that's doing the kind of roustabout work and the land reclamation than the crew that did the P&A work.
Sure.
As you mentioned, yes, the locations can vary tremendously. A location in South Louisiana looks much different than a location in Carlsbad, New Mexico, size-wise, terrain-wise, material-wise. Most locations have some sort of equipment on them. Not every location has a battery. Sometimes they're going to central tank batteries, so all you have is maybe like a pumping unit and some flow lines that need to come out. But every location will have some sort of production equipment. The larger locations will have multi-tank batteries for oil and water storage. They'll have separation apparatus like separators, heater treaters, gun barrels, gas buster. I mean, lots of different
So
equipment.
you've got to haul all that stuff off. Does that go back to the operator, or is that y'all's to do with, or what happens to that?
Depending on the condition, it either gets hauled to it. I would say more often than not, it gets hauled to the junkyard. A lot of these wells that we're plugging are older wells. Sometimes they're newer, and sometimes that equipment has a useful repurposed life. But a lot of times on these older wells, it's just not in good enough condition to be refurbished, and so we haul it in to scrap. But yes, all that equipment has to be properly cleaned out. There's obviously hydrocarbons that are present within the vessels that have to be steam cleaned before they can be transported and moved. So handling all of the clean out, the dismantling, the tear down, and then the loading and hauling off of the equipment is the first step once the well has been plugged, so that anything that was set up as part of the well's production life, equipment wise, is removed once the well's been P&A'd.
There used to be a lot of talk about NORM. What is it?
Yeah.
Naturally occurring radioactive material?
That's right. That's right.
But is that still an issue? Is that something that affects y'all? How is that handled?
It is, yeah. So when oil and gas migrates through production equipment, there is the chance that depending on the formation, if it's an area or a formation that has norm, that norm then accumulates within the production vessels. So when we are doing our cleanout operations, we've got norm Geiger counters that determine it's a micro Rankine unit of measurement that determines whether or not the norm is within the allowable limits or if it's above. If it's above, then the tanks have to be, or vessels have to be cleaned out by a specialty and licensed norm company, which generally is a third party that comes out and handles that, or the equipment is transported to their yard where they're performing that operation, in a kind of a closed loop type system that they've got set up in a yard or a kind of a plant where that equipment gets cleaned out and the norm is disposed of.
Okay, very good. All right, so back on now, you got rid of all the surface equipment, so now you got a bunch of dirt there. So I assume you bring in bulldozers and all are you spreading it out? Are you hauling it off? What do you do with that stuff?
You're right. Yeah. Bulldozers, track hoes, loaders, excavators, equipment that's suited for the surface work. And it really depends on the dirt side of things. If there has ever been any contamination, any leaks of salt water or hydrocarbons that need to be remediated, that has to happen first. So we actually go out and identify areas on the locations to see if there have been any spills or leaks that have impacted the soil. If there is impacted soil, you have to dig it up and haul it off. If you leave it there, nothing will grow. It's contaminated the soil, especially the salts. Obviously will not permit any kind of plant growth or revegetation. So that soil then gets hauled off and taken to a disposal facility. And depending on how much was hauled off, a lot of times you'll have to backfill some of that area with native topsoil. So depending on where you are, you'll either purchase it, or if there's enough to use kind of off the location, you can do that. But you're removing any contaminated or impacted soil. You're often stripping the caliche off of the location as well. Plants generally don't grow real well with caliche, especially if it's not kind of broken up. And obviously caliche is a very hard packed type rock. So that caliche is often stripped and either used to build up kind of nearby lease roads or make road repairs. If not, it can sometimes be buried on the location and kind of capped with some more native topsoil. But yes, the location is essentially, looked at for any spills or potential contamination areas. Those are remediated and removed. And then you've got, a clean sheet of dirt, basically, where you are now presenting elements where revegetation growth can occur.
And so you ultimately end up with how big of a spot around the wellhead, or not the wellhead, but the plug well, that I assume there's like a small area where people will know that there was a well there, or not? Do you just cover it up?
It depends. If there's a dry hole riser, you would know that a well existed. If there's no riser, then you wouldn't. It could just be you may know if you were to return to that well in a decade, and after Mother Nature has kind of taken its course and completely revegetated the area, you may never know that a well was there. It obviously depends quite a bit on the area. Again, locations in Southeast New Mexico tend to kind of revegetate a lot slower. Just given the rainfall and the winds and wind erosion that occurs. So, those locations, the impacts will probably be seen for many more years than places like, East Texas or Louisiana, where you've got a lot more rain, a lot more natural grasses and trees and brush that it comes up and kind of, regrows on a location versus what we see sometimes in West Texas or Southeast New Mexico.
So, and then after that, I assume you have to fill out some forms and send that into the state, or what's the paperwork aspect after the fact?
Yeah, that's right. So once the well's been plugged, once the location's been reclaimed, you've got some final permits and regulatory forms, that have to be submitted so that those wells and those locations can essentially be listed as plugged within the state agency's databases. So you basically submit final forms that follow a certain step-by-step criteria of what you did on the job, dates, plugs that were pumped, services that were performed, and sign off and essentially certify that the work was done, and those get submitted to the agencies so that they can then list those wells in their system as plugged and abandoned, or the site's fully reclaimed. Once that happens, obviously operating companies have to maintain plugging and abandonment bonds with the regulatory agencies. So once all of the final paperwork has been submitted, then those wells can be removed from the bonding for that particular location. So there is definitely some final paperwork that has to be submitted and filed to kind of memorialize that everything has been completed.
So after that's been done, there's really no more financial or liability associated with that, unless I guess there's a leak or some issue that the bond's gone. In theory, it is a done deal.
It's a done deal. That's right. Yeah. Once everything has been completed, if it was done, the work was done properly, and there's no future leaks or spills or anything like that, then it's pretty much it's pretty much done and gone.
So one of the questions I have is also, you have Railroad Commission and state agencies doing plugging, and you have operators doing plugging. Do you see a difference between those two? Of how?
Not really. I mean, the standards are the same for both, whether it's an operator that's doing the work or it's the Railroad Commission doing the work. The work that the regulatory agencies like the Commission and some of the other states are doing is generally more on the orphaned well side of things. Operators are of course supposed to be plugging their wells, and therefore plugging wells before they make it to an orphan state. Obviously, we know that there's a number of orphan wells that exist from operators that have gone defunct over the years, and those wells then fall into the lap of the regulatory agencies to kind of handle, and that's done internally by the commission you mentioned and some others, where they're actually plugging orphaned wells with no financial kind of guarantor or operator of those wells that could pay for the plugging.
Okay. So with all your experience in plugging, are there certain areas that the industry or the regulatory folks could improve on? Do you see some things, some inefficiencies, or some things that, without getting you in trouble with your clients, but are there things that we could be doing better either as an industry or as a government?
Well, I often wonder that to myself, and the answer is I don't know. Sometimes you don't know. The way I look at it, Grant, is like, when wells were plugged in like the 50s or 60s, what they used to do compared to what we do now would be looked at as kind of crazy. I mean, they would pump, from surface, they'd dump some timbers down a wellbore and wait till it bridged off and just dump some cement down it until they saw circulation at surface without addressing any problems. At the time, they thought they were doing the right thing. They didn't know any better. That was just kind of the accepted practice for the day. So are there things that we're doing now that in 30 or 40 years, people will look back and be like, wow, I can't believe they used to plug wells that way? There probably are. I don't know what they are. I don't know if, in 40 or 50 years, we need to run a bond log on every well after a plug has been set to ensure that there was coverage on the backside. You have to kind of sometimes weigh the cost of some of these things, right? I mean, the more steps that you take, the more verification you just continue to kind of drive the costs up, and the higher the costs get to plug wells, the more wells that potentially causes to become orphaned because operators don't have the funds available to pay for some of those things. So you always have to kind of manage and balance, some of the things that you might do that would maybe be thought of as overkill with, well, how much is it going to cost? Because at the end of the day, plugging is an activity that it's capital intensive, and there's never a return on the investment when it comes to plugging. So, companies obviously want to be mindful of managing their well abandonment and their liabilities, but also, you don't necessarily want to bankrupt your company by plugging wells at the same time. So,
And clearly on the other side, you have the environmental issues that you don't want leaks, you don't want
right.
cross communication. And the problem with that is you won't know that for 5, 10, 20 years. And then it's probably too late. So it's a challenge. There's a lot of questions. You alluded to the folks out in West Texas, and we'll be talking to them on another podcast about the issues that they have with old plugged wells. And, now it's a mess, and cleaning up that is going to be a challenge. But it does sound like we've come a long way, and we have a lot of much better technology and kind of duplicative methodology that can really help. So, well, Austin, I really appreciate your time. This is very informative. I think I've learned some things. I think our listeners are going to definitely learn about what plating really takes and what it really is and how it's really done. So I appreciate your time, sir.
Grant, really appreciate you having me on. Anytime I can, speak for a little bit about P&A work, it's a welcomed opportunity. So I really appreciate you inviting me to come along, and look forward to seeing you around the Petroleum Club here in Dallas sometime soon.
Sounds good. Thank you, sir.
All right, take care, Grant. Thanks so much.